Hello, and welcome to Creativity and Multicultural Communication. We're now in week 3, and Creativity and Multicultural Communication is a MOOC. Many of us are in the throes of trying to decide what to do and where to go in this course, or as I like to think of it, in this learning adventure or learning environment. I'm also somewhat in that quandary, and in attempting to add to my own personal learning environment, I dipped into the Twitter sphere. You might have noted some of the tweets coming from Cookie1, which is my Twitter name, and you might have noted that they're disjointed and some have non-existent links, and I'm working on it. I just recently learned how to use bit.ly, bit.ly, and I started a discussion on the use of Twitter within this MOOC. So please help me out, check it out, and help me sort it all out. Thanks. Please don't hesitate to experiment, ask questions, and just play with the new ideas, new concepts, new internet tools and toys, and have fun with the processes. Don't be afraid to fail to understand something or to use something. We connect in this venue, the MOOC, and beyond, and we learn from each other and build on that learning with each other. Today we have George Siemens with us to discuss some of the keys to MOOC understanding and learning. The personal learning environment and network knowledge is the key. Many of you already know about George's globe-trotting adventures and global impact, and for those who may not, he's made major contributions to learners around the globe, and he's having a major impact on education systems around the globe. He shares his experiences and his adventures with any and everyone around the globe, and he's even been a speaker on TEDx, and that's been shared around the globe. So, without further delay, may I introduce to all of you, all around the globe, from somewhere in the world, a major globetrotter, George Siemens. The ball is now in your court, George.
Thanks, Carol. And first of all, I should extend an apology to all members of the group here for having to mess with your schedule. Sometimes when you're thinking around different time zones, you completely get things wrong, and I completely did that. So I do appreciate that Carol, Betty, and others were willing to adjust the schedule on such short notice. And for those of you that were inconvenienced, of course, my apologies. I'm going to look at the concept of open online courses from the perspective of personal learning environments, but in true fashion, I'm going to take a fairly meandering path in order to get there. Now, if you look at, let's say, the structure of information and how we've interacted with information traditionally, I think it gives you a bit of an indication of where we're going in terms of our tools and the kinds of resources that we need to do a better job accessing that information. I think many of you probably recall the wonderful days of hierarchical information, the period of Yahoo where you would go to the Yahoo site and you'd have nice little folders that someone organized for you. And that was really a well-curated web where we had this wonderful opportunity to go to a place and click a bunch of folders like we were still living in a physical world. And one of the problems with new technology is that on the one hand it gets rolled out and we get it to do in a very McLuhan-esque sense what the old technology did. But once you bring it in, it does start to create new opportunities, and people inevitably sort of figure out what those new opportunities are. And that's what happened when Google stepped onto the stage 13 years and 1 day ago and started offering a way to access information that was distributed. So instead of trying to organize things in a strong, categorized manner, they opted to take an approach that was inherently networked and distributed. And I think that's precisely what needs to happen in terms of our learning content. More recently, and I don't quite know where these will end up, there's this notion of socialized information interaction, and that's something that I think most of us experience, whether in the form of Facebook, which is a Latin term that means spawn of the devil, or whether it's in a tool that's perhaps a little bit more social or a little less controlling of your information in the form of Twitter or similar tools. But essentially we're participating in these kind of social network structures. And we're using these to filter and to make sense of our information. Now, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. I mean, I'm starting to equate data ownership with land ownership, from 300 years ago, which means that if you don't own your data and if you don't own your spaces of interaction, then essentially you're a squatter and someone else is taking advantage of the benefits of your labor. But we'll pick that concept up in a little bit. And then, of course, now we're at an interesting stage where I don't know if we quite understand what this means yet. On the one hand, we have this growth of gamed information structures where we're being rewarded, whether it's simple things like badges and whether it's more complex approaches, such as actual game systems where you're trying to use these to teach. We're seeing a bit of a change in how we relate to that information again, and more recently a tool that I'm absolutely fascinated by, Palantir, and our company I should say, simply because of their connection with trying to make sense of the world at a really complex scale, the financial markets, U.S. military intelligence. So the information structure has really gone from hierarchical to gamed and some kind of an analytics model being attached to it in what seems like surprisingly a period of less than 15 years. Now, the difficulty, though, and this is why we're seeing this trajectory of changes in how we interact with information, is that we literally don't have the ability to make sense of this stuff. I mean, in the current mechanisms that we've adopted. So as a consequence, we need to start looking for different ways than social systems in order to make sense of that information. And the problem is coupled or intensified by the fact that information is increasingly, from a school system, a diminishing value. Its data is critically valuable to many of the social web companies and certainly is being used extensively to profile individuals. But in terms of what's the value of packaged curriculum, it's really getting down to a ballpark zero. And one example that I find quite interesting is the illustration of Microsoft's Encarta. Initially, when they were rolling it out and they did some focus groups, and it ended up being, well, this thing is going to be, I'd pay $1,500 for this tool because it was an amazing concept at the time. By the time they rolled it out, though, they opted to go for, I believe it was the $395 price point, even though their focus groups stated they would pay lots more than that. By the time it actually shut down, I think they were selling it for, this is in 2009, they were selling it for about $20 or $22.95 or something like that. So the value of information in literally a period that runs about 15 years went from a really strong economic point, package structured information, to something that was worth ballpark zero. And the reason, it's very important to understand the reason behind this, is that the metrics of information creation and consumption are different when you're engaged in a online environment or a networked environment than when you're engaged in more of a traditional setting. So the argument that I'm putting forward here is that because of who we are as people, and I'll bring up this concept of informavores next, but because of who we are as people, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that we actually socialize as a means of making sense of information, namely that our desire to interact with a sensible world is to a fair degree what drives human social interaction. I don't think we socialize exclusively based on the sense of, oh, it's human nature. I think socialization is a sense-making strategy that we incorporate. And this concept of informavores that Miller put out in 1983, I think is accurate here as well, in that, as individuals, we do quite literally solicit and seek information in such a fashion that it's almost on par with other biological models. For example, Piroli and Card in '95 put out a paper where they talk about information foraging as this process where we seek information as if we are seeking food, and it's this activity of finding it, handling it, making sense of it. And so information foraging is something that we do through these social networks that we participate in on a daily basis. And these social networks, though, are transitioning because they're increasingly becoming informationally or analytics-driven networks. And that has some significant implications in an educational context. But I'll tease that a little bit more later on when I start getting into a greater sense of analysis on what that ends up being when we apply it to the formal education sector. I'm just going to pause here, see if there's any questions. Can I sort of dove in and threw a bunch of words at you all in a row? And if there's any questions that arise now, please dive in. I see Betty has a question. Do children do this better than adults? I think it's interesting because it's really a matter of what is being done, because in order to form coherent worldviews, which is really the primary intent of our interaction with information, in order to form coherent worldviews, we actually need a certain degree of knowledge and the ability to connect those knowledge elements. And there's something in the research, Kaminsky in the literature area at least states that people who have advanced knowledge structures are actually better able to navigate ambiguous information settings than people who are new to a space. They actually require a degree of structure in order to begin to form some of these settings. So perhaps the focus on the age may be less fruitful an area of exploration than if we focus on the knowledge of the individual, because the more knowledgeable we are, the more capable we are of connecting elements. Norman, do I think data is property? Yes, I do. Carol, perhaps also the experience and application of this knowledge. Yeah, I would say certainly. I mean, to a degree, this application shouldn't be individualistic. It should be driven by a network structure of interaction, this notion of self-organization, which I'll get into in a little bit. Well, Norman, if I said people were property, then you should probably take me out and shoot me, because that would be a bad perspective. No, I absolutely do not think that people are property. Except kids. Kids are property. Up until a certain age, you can do what you want with them and make them clean your house and mow the lawn and stuff like that. Any other questions? No, data. Norman, data does not make up people. Biologically, that's who we are as people, and data, DNA, is a component or a representation or an analysis of that structure when you render it into a DNA structure, but that's very different than, let's say, digital information and digital structure. For example, if I look at data and if I have a blog post and you copy it, that's the same thing. But if I have one arm and you take it, then I'm suddenly missing one arm, which is a bad thing. And so I think in that regard, there are elements in which data has properties at a DNA level, but I think it's quite different than the approach that you get when you copy data in a different way. I don't think you can yet, Norman, to be honest. If you biologically have the means to do that, then perhaps it would be fine, but at this point you can't. Okay, so I'm going to leave it, at least you can't duplicate it. You might be able to transplant it, but you can't duplicate it. All right, so I'm going to leave that area of discourse and move on. I don't see if there's any other questions coming out. But so at this point, I want to turn to how we start to make sense of this model in an educational context. Because if we're facing this climate where information is abundant, and we're facing this challenge where we are relying on social means to try and organize that information structure, and then we start to rely on different systems to help us orient ourselves meaningfully to the world, then we have to ask questions that come down really to who decides how that information is structured. Right now, the university decides for us, essentially. They'll say, this is what you're going to take in this course. This is the curriculum that's important in this topic, and we kind of have to toe the line. Now, I know that's perhaps a little bit more direct than it actually needs to be, because there's certain areas of peripheral exploration with curriculum, but by and large, the educator or an instructional designer decides what we need to learn, and generally also how we're going to learn it. So in this regard, a self-organizing social system, this is based on an article by, I think it was Aaron Edwards, David Wiley. They look at, this is from 2003, there is an increasing ability where people can self-organize through a huge array of tools and technologies that are now surprisingly commonplace and surprisingly easy for people to use and begin to interact with. Now, these self-organizing systems are essentially defined by complexity. And complexity science, which I think really is, if you boil down all of the stuff of Web 2.0 and all of this discussion of social networks and even this growth of analytics and mining, I think you get to a point where the core foundational change that we face educationally is that the system that we're premising everything on is a complex system. And a complex system is one where you have a diverse group of actors that are interacting dynamically. And this happens in a continual space of feedback. So what I mean by that is, if we end up looking at the world in a complicated way, then we see everything as having a proper place. It's like a watch where every piece belongs, or a puzzle piece where every piece belongs. A complex system, in contrast, is more like a weather system. And in this kind of a model, everything is technically in flux, and we can only know an outcome based on how the elements interact. that means that we can say tomorrow's going to be sunny, but if a cold front moves more rapidly than another front does, it'll change the outcome of the weather. And so that's what we're looking at when we say these are dynamic systems that are interacting with one another, and it's occurring in really a sea of feedbacks. Okay, so with those last two slides, which technically should be about a course in their own right, namely the one on complex systems and the way in which individuals interact in a self-organizing model, I'm going to turn now to talking very briefly about this importance of information exchange as a function of networks. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is that technically networks are the expression of a complex system, because networks can form and reform ties at a fairly rapid pace, something that an established or structured model, such as school curriculum, can't do. This information exchange, how we interact with one another, happens through these social or technological systems. And one of the things that becomes very important is our tie strength, how we're connected to others, and also our network positioning, namely where are we located within a network. So if you look, for example, at a slide such as this, you have over here in this area a fairly centrally connected node. Now, again, this is what I'm emphasizing is how are you positioned within a network, because that's going to influence the kind of information you access. This is a huge clustered area where this individual obviously has preferred information access to an individual that's located over here. Now, of course, the way you position yourself, at least in a typical social network, is through increased quality of interaction with one another. Now, so what I mean by that is if you interact more effectively with people on Twitter, you share information with them, you comment on their tweets, or you comment on their blogs, you'll progressively position yourself more effectively. I mean, in a social network that's not heavily structured, namely the university hasn't said this is a class, because a hierarchy is a sense of a network. But if it's something where individuals form it on their own and they have personal agency, then the way you develop positioning in a network is through contribution to the structure itself. And the more you contribute, the more you get involved. Now, one of the things I've noticed with, let's say, DS-106, which I've tracked more peripherally, and those of you who haven't, it came out of a course that Jim Green ran last year, and watching how people move from peripheral participants to, I'm not sure, does Jim call them DJs or whatever, but to the point where they're more central in that DS-106 network is fascinating to watch. And you almost see an individual who finds out first how to actually listen to the station, and then you have an ecosystem around that, everything from Darcy Norman setting up a web page so you can just sort of listen rather than having to download a player, and the list goes on. And by participating, by engaging in the conversation and by sharing that information with others, you're essentially becoming part of the network. So you're allocated in a network structure based on your shared interaction with others and your contribution to the network structure as a whole. Now, let's take that with a backdrop, the sense of you become who you are in the network by your sustained contributions. And let's look briefly at what's the difference between a learning management system and between a personal learning environment. And I'm not going to read all of these points because, well, you can read them yourself, I guess. But the biggest change, I think, is how is the system structured and who has the ability to control things. So a centralized structure in a learning management system means that the university controls stuff. You basically just have to toe the line in terms of login and access. Personal learning environments and networks are decentralized, they're adaptive, but the one big thing with learning management systems is they're scalable. You can go from 1 student to 5,000 students, and in theory at least, the system can handle it. If you take a distributed network and you go from 100 to 10,000, inevitably you'll have to start to cluster smaller systems and smaller structures to make sense of it. Another aspect really is the control focus. Who controls it? And my view of control always is, who has the ability to say someone can't be here? And in a personal learning environment, essentially, you're the one that decides that for yourself. Whereas in a learning management system, someone kind of decides that for you. They're going to enroll you, they're going to roster you in the course, and when you're done after a certain period, they won't let you come back in. And there's other factors at play, but essentially that's this distinction between a learning management system and a personal learning environment. And I just briefly want to derail here and talk a little bit more about this notion of data and data ownership. Data is today, I think, the most valuable transactional entity that we have in society. And by this I mean we're constantly leaving trails of our interactions. We leave this when we interact with, we call someone, we text someone, we email someone, and there's a huge industry currently in the form of advertising, but it's developing in personalization and other strands where our data is being used for marketing purposes, profiling us, targeted advertising, recommender systems. This data comes from a variety of sources. I mean, some of you may have read this last week that OnStar continues to track you even after you've unsubscribed from the OnStar system, or you may have encountered the discussion that even if you've logged out of Facebook, Facebook still tracks your activities by like buttons on web pages, so you're technically still being targeted by Facebook. So data is incredibly valuable. But the difficulty, I guess, around data is that we're giving most of it away. It's probably one of the most significantly, it's enormously abundant in a general sense, but when it can be specifically tied to a person, it becomes incredibly valuable because then you can market and target a particular individual. So that's, I think, why the growth of data and data analysis is so significant today. And in my eyes, the point I made before is that this data is generating revenue for others. So people such as Facebook or Google or otherwise are basically taking the resources that we're interacting with, our images in a discussion on Flickr or our resources when it's posted to Facebook. This resource or this data is being used to generate value for themselves or as an organization. And in a lot of cases, ownership of that data is slipping from us as well. In a university sense, what this means is that when we leave a course, we lose the opportunity to own our own contributions. We've essentially given away, what's a potentially valuable resource for personal reflection and future growth. Universities aren't yet at least turning that into economic value point, at least not as directly as Facebook and others do, but still, the issue is that data is a resource that we need to think about who owns it and who has the ability to take it from us. And right now, Facebook and other tools definitely have the ability to take that content from us or even to deny us access to our own content. So that's sort of a backdrop. And if you then look at personal learning environments, what we're seeing here in terms of how approaches are being done, I'll give you, sort of a quick 4-point run up here, and then I'll pause for questions right after this. Very basic level, and this is what a lot of what I would probably call, early adopters or the more geeky folks, they're going to basically roll their own PLE, if you will, and they're going to use a combination of blogs and Delicious and different resources. They're going to form simple connections, but they're technically skilled enough to navigate and pull those pieces together. Others, though, are, and this is as the skills go up, or these elements go up, you get a different kind of a model altogether. You have integrated suites, ELG being one, Facebook, if you're using it for learning, is another, CloudWorks, which is an initiative out of Open University, and so on. There's a few institutional ones that are coming up. Ning has been around for a while, but they have a bit of an identity crisis. The Landing is one that we're running at Athabasca, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Sapo is one that's coming out of Portugal. But these are institutional platforms that are trying to do this stuff here, but with more of an institutional feel. Now, there's a good argument to be made that, well, maybe that's actually a bit of a violation of the spirit of a PLE, but nonetheless, if anything is going to be a success, doesn't matter what it is, somebody's going to find a way to institutionalize it and commercialize it. And then if you get to a more advanced level, if this is the right word, this is where it's scalable and distributed, and we don't have the right model here yet. I mean, we're talking open online courses, but that certainly isn't the full model yet. Or a tool such as Grasshopper, where we're trying to aggregate tools and create the daily around it. I mean, these are models where we're trying to keep the spirit of this without going through the institutionalization processes that are listed here. Now, that's not 100% the best approach, but yeah, no, Carol, that's a good point. I should probably use the language. It's more complex to interact with than advanced. But what we're trying to do with this type of model is preserve the individual's ability to own their own spaces and their own data and their interactions without moving to integrated or institutional suites. But you're having the benefit of scalability, but you're not losing the value of autonomy. So I'm going to pause here for questions, audio or otherwise. Okay, I'm just going to jump in. In terms of Diaspora, I actually just got an invite from them this past week. It was something that was in the works for a long period of time. You know, quite honestly, the problem with Diaspora, it presented a solution to a problem that existed in 2008 or 2009, but you know, and if they would have had a tool ready, it might have made an impact. But right now, I hate to be rude about it, but I don't really think it's a big factor to me. I mean, I'm not interested in looking at it. I've sort of gotten a bit tired of Facebook as a whole, and somewhat with Google Plus, and I'm increasingly thinking I like the value of owning my own spaces, owning my own points of interaction. So I'm more inclined to sort of continue going back here, rather than something like a tool that duplicates to a degree the functionality of other tools like Facebook. Now, we have a project that we're doing at Athabasca University, which is called The Landing, which is an ELG install, and it's been very successful because people prefer some level of privacy. Not everybody wants to shape their identity on the wide open web, so that certainly is a bit of a problem. Well, Betty, I'm not sure if I would say that's necessarily my preference as such, but my real preference is that individuals have the ability to form their identity in a way that they prefer, that individuals own the outcome of that data when they've shared it, and that individuals have the right of access to that without someone else being able to revoke their control. And so in that regard, my emphasis is on any system that reflects that ideal. So technically, Diaspora as an open system might be it, but it's not something that I've played around with yet because I've decided that I'm actually more comfortable with, you know, using WordPress and using a variety of different tools, archiving, you know, information. I mean, I use SlideShare. I retain rights when I upload stuff there, and so technically, yeah, SlideShare could shut down. But, you know, again, I wouldn't lose that information necessarily. So I guess the short perspective is I prefer any tool that allows me control of that data and that doesn't have the ability to deny me access to it in the future. Okay, so I'm not sure if I quite addressed that well enough, but again, my primary point is that students need to own their own spaces of interaction because you're shaping your online identity, you're shaping your digital identity as a consequence of your interaction in these spaces. And I think it's fine if you participate in Facebook or you participate in some of these other tools. Obviously, I mean, you know, do what you will, but it's that issue of how is my identity being shaped, and when universities require an individual to shape their identity in a tool like you know, Blackboard, for example, I think there's something being missed in the process for future potential identity development. You need a home base, and your home base is one that you need to own. From there, if you want to play on Twitter and play on Facebook, that's fine, but at least you have your core space where things sort of flesh out from. Now, one of the things that's happened in response to the limitations of learning management systems and some of the concerns about organizational structure is that there's been a development of a variety of tools that I think are doing a fairly nice, or approaches at least, that are giving us a different model of teaching and learning than what we've perhaps used in the past. Now, these are a variety of open online courses. You know, DS-106 was mentioned earlier, but there's a raft of them. And really, I think it started with I mean, David Wiley and Alec Koros ran something in 2007 when they first ran a course. We did a series of open online conferences in 2007, which you know, has morphed into the open courses that we've done. And by we, I mean Stephen Downs, Dave Cormier, and myself. And so since then, there's been a variety of courses and that different institutions, or in some cases, just individuals have run. I mean, several of these are university affiliated. I'd say about half of them. I mean, the Moby MOOC DS-106 was, ECNI was, this one was, the Creativity and Multicultural Communication was, the Connectivism course. I mean, so those were university affiliated, but they weren't necessarily done at the same level. Or let me try that again. They were university affiliated. They were typically some opportunity for credit, but there's other models that's more professional development focused or just personal interest focused. You know, the Open Course and Education Futures was one. Moby MOOC was another that I don't believe, at least Moby MOOC, had some formal recognition. So these are the open online courses. There's a raft coming up, and you're certainly seeing with Stanford now doing their artificial intelligence model right now on a similar premise, and I think they're up to like 250,000 people that are actively being that are enrolled in the course. The participation rates, which I'll talk about a little bit, are far, far lower. But what you find interesting with these courses is that people use a mess of different tools, and it requires a completely different tool sets than learning in a structured hierarchical manner. So, for example, we had people using, this was in 2008, so it's a lifetime ago, because we still had Second Life and a few others that were being used at that point. Second Life, I haven't seen that prominent in open courses recently, but I know there are individuals that are offering Second Life components, so that doesn't mean much. But in the courses I've done, at least, I've seen a bit of a reduced interest in Second Life, but I know there's a thriving community of education that is involved. But we had Moodle, blogs, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Ning, Ustream, PageFlakes. You know, all of these tools were being used. But interestingly, one of the tools that was most common, and maybe it's because it was most consistent throughout the course, is the daily, which is the daily email that summarizes the various posts and the discussions that are going on. And so these tools are valuable in helping people form some kind of a center, and I'll talk about that a little later on, but that's really the big problem with these distributed open courses, is that we've lost this center that we've had from different spaces. In the past, you know, a classroom where we know we go to the classroom and everything is there, or we go to a Moodle forum and we know all of the learning content that we need to know is there. Now, the problem with open online courses, and this isn't necessarily universal, but it's one that we've encountered, which is there's diminishing participation. As the course progressed, participation generally, I mean, you get a few bubbles here and there where it pops up again, but, you know, consider this. In the general forum early in the course, we had 1,252 participants and 146 participants, 1,252 posts. By the end, week 12, 29, 119. Now, we shouldn't necessarily expect something that different, because people are going to participate in different ways, and they're going to take what they want and leave what they don't want. But there's a question here that needs to be asked. I mean, why do we have this pattern of engagement going on as a course progresses? I mean, what is it? Is it, you know, people are weeding out because the format is too frustrating? Are they getting what they want, but they're reading instead of participating? I mean, these are the kinds of questions you know, we absolutely don't have a clue on right now, but we're grappling with, and I'm sure in CMC as well, these are the kinds of questions that the facilitators will need to face too. I'll pause there, and just a quick question for the audience. I mean, for those of you that are in this course, how are you finding your participation habits? Are you enjoying it? Are you finding that it's frustrating and overwhelming? Or so what's your state of mind in terms of course participation? Interesting point, Nellie. I mean, maybe you can just let us know a little bit of why you're enjoying it less and less, because I think there's a value there. that's of interest. I think I like the point that Elise mentioned, narrowing it down to a few tools that work for you. I think that's really, it's, you need to develop strategies where you are able to take what you want out of a course. You have to define what you want, because one of the things that's missing in an open course is the guiding structure that a faculty member often provides. And so in this case, you are essentially setting your own goals and determining your own path through that curriculum and also the tools that you're using. So I think that makes a big difference. So certainly agree with your point there. Do what works for you. Allison's point as well, I think, is quite important, is how do you sort of deal with this subtle guilt, that I'm taking a course, but I'm not happy with how I'm participating. And my view generally is, and that's the whole point of these courses, you dive in when you want and you step out when life doesn't permit you necessarily to do so. So I think that's certainly a valid perspective. Just looking, Norman mentions how to combine those two. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I'm not sure what your thoughts are specifically on that, but role playing. I think it's initially where with role playing games that was part of the reason why the MOOC term came about, which everybody seems to hate, but still uses it anyway. Just reading a few others. Yeah, Betty, I fully agree. It does require discipline. To participate in a course like this, I think it requires that you're driving your reason for being there. You have to know what is that you want out of that course. And if you're not getting it, you have to either, adjust the actions that you're engaged in or the tools that you're using in order to get what you want. For some people, simply networking, connecting with others can be satisfying. For other people, you're more focused on the content and getting a deeper understanding of the content. So all of those do require you defining for yourself what an educator perhaps defined for you in the past. Lorette mentions, the difficulty with time to participate in discussions. I think that varies as well, Lorette, from week to week and subject to subject. I think if you're comfortable with reading and feeling that you're gaining something out of a course, then I think that's great, even if you're not necessarily participating. I think it's, if you get the opportunity to, as I mentioned earlier, the type of information you access is a function of how you're positioned in a network. And positioning in a network occurs as a consequence of giving to the network through interactions. So looking at different, these mentions, different tools are being used, Zotero, cataloging, perfect. Just quickly scrolling down here. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to release the mic if anybody has a question audio-wise. Otherwise, I'll continue plodding on. Okay, so here's the model that we're using, which is, again, it's a hybrid model. So, it's not like we've totally done away with learning management systems, but instead we have blogs which are aggregated through Grasshopper. And it doesn't have to be Grasshopper. I mean, you can use any tool that aggregates on a personal, individual level. You can do something like this through Google Reader, but then you don't necessarily open it up to the broader comment ecosystem. We use social bookmarking, Twitter, other social media, learning management systems as well. And of course, what you get in your email each day in CMC is exactly this. It's this aggregated list of discussions and activities, and hopefully that leads to comments and interactions on the sites of other people. So this is really the infrastructure of interaction in an open online course. And that's important because in a traditional course, now I'm simplifying things, but I think it's still accurate, which is that the educator essentially creates these lines here. In terms of this is the structure of the course, these are the resources you're going to read, the videos you're going to watch, this is where we're going to do it because they own the spaces of learning as well as the content and the interaction. Now in an open online course, you have something a little bit different. You have less boundaries and you have individuals that create and expand the knowledge domain based on their discussions and on the resources that they share, which is really why you get some awesome serendipitous learning moments in these kinds of settings because people have the ability to shape the structure of the course based on their interest. And to a degree, each learner-produced artifact helps to recenter the interaction in the course. And that allows, so if, let's say, I start with a reading and I say, oh, read this resource by, so-and-so, and then as a result of that resource, you move forward and somebody contributes a concept map of how they see the readings. Suddenly that artifact, that sense-making artifact that someone created based on that reading, becomes the new point of discussion. So the discussion gets recentered as a consequence of this. And I think that's a vital concept, because the recentering and the control that individuals have on these types of interaction is quite critical in this process. And just your questions, yes, actually, and I think Dave Cormier is running a course at PEI, University of Prince Edward Island, this fall, which is targeted exclusively to first-year students in a university setting. And again, it's an open online course as well. So the argument then is how we are connected influences the type of information that we encounter. But here's the real issue that arises. When you fragment information, you also have a loss of coherence. And a coherence is critical in order to understand how topics are related. We see this all the time in our personal lives. I mean, yeah, we use simple words like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. But underneath that is an incredibly complex cognitive process, where we are trying to make sense of how the world fits. So we get a new phenomenon and we either somewhat ignore it, we recognize it's there, but we don't necessarily engage with it, or we get into a situation where we try and make sense of it through interaction, through querying, and through questioning. So we want coherence because our ability to act is a function of how we've interpreted a situation. This is common. I mean, I'll use a military analogy. You really can't act in a situation until you somewhat form coherence in terms of what the landscape looks like. And so individuals need to personally, at least, be able to get that sense of understanding on what are we facing. How do we take these different elements that are at play and realize how they're networked and connected, and as a consequence of how they're networked and connected, we are able to evaluate what's happening. And yes, 2008175, this is exactly what everybody does. I mean, it's not just medical professionals, it's not just historians. I mean, people do this constantly. We cannot not try and form coherence. We pull these patterns together in order to have an understanding of what's going on in the world. And so, yeah, as Norman mentioned, everything from journalists to historians to doctors to teachers to parents to grandparents. I mean, it's just what we do. The problem, though, that the siloed information model of a news program or a textbook is being fragmented, which requires that forming that coherence is completely different today than it was. If somebody gives you a textbook and your view of interacting with that text is to memorize it, understand it, and then regurgitate the coherent framework presented back to the educator, that's one model. But on the other hand, if your information is scattered across blog posts and different sites and different resources and different readings and different artifacts, you have a very different kind of a process in order to make sense of it. And so this information fragmentation is a problem because primarily networked information doesn't have a center. And the fact that it lacks a center is what gives us a lot of discomfort with it, especially when we're new in open online courses. And it's not just open online courses. The first time I looked at I think it was a Gopher browser, it irritated me that I could get hopelessly lost and forget where I was because I wasn't skilled yet at navigating information. And this feeling of an open online course is what causes, I think, a fair number of the high dropout issues that we have, because people are looking for centers, but they're not finding it, and this coherence is a key issue. So we need skills. This is my point here. We need skills to be able to reform that coherence in distributed settings so that we can still act meaningfully. So this means we have to form this coherence ourselves, and we can do that through a variety of settings in order to make sense of it, because we want to see these patterns. We want to be able to recognize the important elements, or as Vannevar Bush mentioned, we want to be able to, not get lost in the mass of the inconsequential. And so what we end up doing in this kind of a setting is we create what I'll call temporary centers. through foraging strategies, information foraging strategies. And these temporary centers can be as simple as a tag. You know, a course tag helps to center some of the information. But again, this what I'm emphasizing is we get these clusters that we then have to connect rather than a textbook that we have to memorize. We can also do this through Google Alerts or similar sites. We can do this through social bookmarking, Digo, and other tools. All of the courses I've been involved in the last, I think, 7 years, I've forced people to make a concept map. Some people like it, many people hate it, but it's really the only way that I can understand or communicate really the importance of being able to pull pieces together. So entity relatedness is critical through people pulling these pieces together. Clustered aggregation is another concept, because what happens in these open courses is people eventually form smaller subsets. They're not capable of making sense of who is, you can't track 500, 1,000, 2,000, or in Stanford's case, 250,000 people in an online course by yourself. You need to form subclusters where you can make sense with other people that have similar interests. So you begin to form these smaller clustered aggregated spaces. So we're dealing with how do we create a centralized message through distributed means. And that's really one of the big challenges that we face, because depth of understanding and expertise is a time process. It takes a long time. It takes a period of incubation and reflection, sort of smashing together random ideas, bringing together peripheral elements. You know, Don Swanson has this concept of undiscovered public knowledge, which means that the answer to many scientific problems is actually known in a different field, but because we're not necessarily connected properly, it's not known in our discipline. So these are kind of challenges that we face, and depth of understanding is a requirement of time. So now I'm moving into the last several slides, and then I'll pause, see if there's any questions, and then do a wrap-up on this. So I've got about 4 slides left here. This is a dramatically simplified model, but still more or less accurate. Many traditional courses really have, and I'm really focused. These are the boundary. These are the knowledge boundaries that are set. And as I stated earlier, I'm interested in who can control what we can access and when we can access it. And so in traditional course faculty, they form these boundaries around core content. And then the learners, to some degree, have to interact with the boundaries that faculty has created as a consequence. Now, when we switch and we ask information, or we ask learners in an open online course to be information foragers and to navigate these information systems and to contribute and to share, we get a model that looks a little bit more like this. I mean, yes, you still have the faculty members and the core content, but you get an awful lot of peripheral stuff happening. You know, you can bring in external experts into your course. You can bring in peripheral learners where individuals have the ability to connect with people who aren't part of the course in terms of formal credit, but they're getting value out of this process of interaction. The value of open educational resources. I mean, there's so many excellent quality resources. Some are, you know, formal OERs like MIT. Others are, you know, TED Talks, which isn't really an OER, but it's accessible, and so you can interact with those. Co-created content, right, where, you know, a group of individuals within a course and external to a course create things together. So I'm going to go back to the DS-106 illustration because I find it interesting when people self-organize and amplify the value of a resource. And I really think it would be awesome if you know, someone, Jim Groom, would pull together a list of how these things developed. You know, when did DS-106 become a radio station, because that's essentially the lasting legacy of the open online course that Jim ran. And as a consequence of that, you want to look at who contributed when. You know, when did Grant Potter come along and say, hey, look at this? And then someone else came along and said, oh, well, why don't you consider this piece over here? So a group of individuals, and ultimately now you've got a URL, again, to Darcy Norman's site, and you can pop in and you can listen to the station, and it's been sort of the complexity of interacting with Radio DS-106 has been reduced. But that's exactly what happened. There was a co-creation process where individuals pulled it together and understanding what that process look like? Who contributed and when, and what were their motivations? I think is a valuable concept for educators to understand. All right, so this then is basically the second last slide. What I found in looking at online courses, in open online courses at least, is that there's this process, a series of techniques that people go through. One of the biggest ones is Sensegiving through artifact creation and sharing. E-portfolios, but let me just quickly drop in and answer that here. But e-portfolios, I think, can be a valuable part of it. And in fact, if a personal learning environment is done properly, it actually is an e-portfolio in terms of you're capturing your learning as you're going forward. Later on, if you want to select certain pieces of it, you might have to create a, an entry page into your PLE resources that you've created and shared over a period of time. But that can be as simple as just simply pulling together your best thinking and writing and artifacts and resources. So anyways, the techniques that learners engage in, Sensegiving through artifact creation and sharing. One of the biggest things I found was language games. I mean, Wittgenstein really nailed this one, which is that people make sense of their world through debating language. And we had this constantly, especially in CCK08. It was a constant battle for language. It's almost like language is contested space. And a concept that I encountered from an individual, actually, when I was at university in South Africa 3 weeks ago, he mentioned this notion of curriculum as contested space, an article he had done. And I think language is the same way. We want to control what a word means, and we debate it, sometimes to clarify, not to do anything inappropriate necessarily, or to use it for, goofy purposes, but, literally to be able to understand and interact with others. So we connect on these pieces, these language games with other people as a means of clarifying what we mean. Carl Weick's concept in Sensemaking, which is, how do I know what I think until I see what I say, which is, I think, a profound concept, but it's something that we need to still keep in our mind, that's exactly, we become the people that we are through our expression and interaction with others. Knowledge expansion, this is a big one. Constantly, CCK08 and all courses I've been involved since, we start with weekly readings, but from there people contribute resources and expand this domain extremely rapidly, and that's one of the vital aspects that comes out of it. Additionally, we have wayfinding cues and symbols that come out as a consequence, where people sort of begin to interact as they navigate the space. All of you probably, definitely the first time you took an open course, you went through this period of spatial disorientation because there was no longer one place for everything. And as you went through these spaces, you started to see, oh, okay, I go here for this and I go there for that. And so it was really, you had to spatially orient yourself, and that's this concept of wayfinding. And of course, this notion of a continual organization through ongoing creation and sharing. And we do in an open course, which is why I emphasize that we have to create our identity. We have to put ourselves into existence through the artifacts and the resources that we create in an open online course. So with that, I just want to mention a project I've touched on this twice at Athabasca University called The Landing. Not everybody wants to participate in a wide open social space like the web, and there are different approaches that we've put together in this case, which is using the benefit of a social network service and social network interactions, but with greater privacy controls on the part of individuals. So this is what people are able to do in terms of closing off some of these discussion elements and making sure that they're finding that they're getting what they want out of that particular course format. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to do with this setting here is we give people a little bit more structure. So it's not quite the wide open web, but you still have the ability to largely act as if it was the wide open web. I'll end there, and I guess ask if there's any questions in the last few minutes.
Well, I thank you so very much, George, for joining us today. It really has been enlightening, enriching, and you're getting off by the top of the hour, so I hope you make your next appointment. Thank you, everybody who attended, participated, chatted in the chat box today. And this is recorded and will be posted within the course, as well as the simulcast that Jeff has been kind enough to do today. Thanks to everybody. And George, have any words of wisdom as we roll out of here today?
Thanks very much for the invite, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.